explore the Jewish community history of the Netherlands, Holland. And we did a video, I think about 9 months ago, or something, where we spoke about the history based on a very, very good article encapsulating the history itself. But now it's going to be a multi-part series where we're going to go from more towards the beginning of time and progress as time goes on, because a lot goes on in the Netherlands, especially in the 15, 16, 1700s, especially at that point in time. So I guess it's probably going to be a 3, maybe even 4-part series, might be. We're still in the middle of learning about Tunisia also, and we haven't finished that yet. We're going to probably wrap that up tonight. And let's learn about the Netherlands here, Holland. But always an inviting topic, and a lot of history and a lot of heritage, we must point out, actually comes from this country in of itself. There's a lot of rabbis we have to speak about over here. And just recording this here from the city of Bet Shemesh, friends, over here. As we're going to go back from more towards the beginning of times of when the actual history actually started itself. So we know that there's a lot to talk about, especially about Amsterdam and so on and so forth, and what went on all throughout different windows of time in history. Now, really, the history of the Jewish community in the Netherlands dates back to a more late part of the 16th century and the 17th century, when the Sephardic Jews would actually come from Portugal at that point in time and from Spain, and they would begin to settle in Amsterdam and various other, I think, pockets of other Dutch cities we have to point out over here, friends. So, okay. So let's just say, because the Netherlands at the time was, let's say, a more rare center of religious tolerance. Now, since Portuguese Jewish people had not lived under rabbinic authority for decades, the first generation of those embracing their ancestral religion had to be more formally instructed in Jewish belief and practice. I'd say, you could say, contrast with Ashkenazic Jews from Central Europe, who, although they were unfortunately persecuted, they lived in more organized communities. 17th century Amsterdam was referred to as the Dutch Jerusalem for its importance, let's say, as a center of Jewish life. In the mid-17th century, Ashkenazic Jews from Central and Eastern Europe migrated. Both groups migrated for reasons of religious liberty, to escape persecution, which was taking place, and now to be able to live openly as Jewish people in, let's say, a separate, organized, autonomous Jewish communities under rabbinic authority. They were also drawn by the economic opportunities in the Netherlands, which was at that point in time, as world trade comes, it was a major, let's say, hub over there at that point in time. Now, the Netherlands was once part of the Spanish Empire, as part of the Burgundian inheritance of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. In 1581, the northern Dutch provinces declared independence from Catholic Spain, touching off an extended conflict with the Spanish. A principal move was to practice, let's say at that point in time for them, from that angle of their Protestant Christianity. Obviously, we totally denounced it as Jewish people, Orthodox Jewish people, straight away. And I think then forbidden under Spanish rule it was. Religious tolerance, freedom of conscience was an essential principle of the newly independent state. Portuguese Jews at that point in time, Hebrews of the Portuguese nation, strongly identified ethnically as Portuguese and viewed Ashkenazic Jews with ambivalence in the early modern period. That's what's written over here by Wikipedia. And let's say the fortunes and size of the Portuguese Jewish community declined after the Dutch trade was undermined by wars with the English in the late 17th century. Simultaneously, the Ashkenazic population rapidly grew and had remained dominant in numbers ever since that period in time. Now, following the Dutch Republic, the end of the Dutch Republic, the French-influenced Batavian Republic emancipated the Jewish people in 1796, making them full citizens. Under the monarchy established by someone named Napoleon Bonaparte, obviously, King Louis Napoleon removed all disciplinary powers of the Jewish communal leaders in Parnassim over their communities, making them functionaries of the state. I think it was in 1940, there was approximately 140,000 Jewish people in the Netherlands during Nazi occupation in World War II. The Holocaust in the Netherlands was unfortunately very, very brutal, with approximately 75% of the Jewish population deported to concentration and extermination camps. most famously Anne Frank, whose German Jewish family fled to Amsterdam. Only around 30,000 Jews in Dutch soil would survive this war. The Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, which I recommend everyone to go to, housed in a former synagogue, has a major collection relating to Jewish history in the Netherlands, in Holland. Starting in the late 20th century, there are, I think, official public spaces marking the Holocaust in the Netherlands, including the Dutch National Museum, inaugurated by the Dutch King in 2024. We're going to speak about that more in the later parts of the series, about that specific era in itself. Now, let's talk about before the Dutch Republic. It was likely that the earliest Jews arrived in Low Countries, or let's say present-day Belgium and Netherlands, during the Roman conquest and early Common Era. Little is known about these early people that would settle there, other than they were not very numerous. So it was a small amount of people at that stage in time. For some time, the Jewish presence consisted, let's say, mostly of small isolated communities and scattered families. I think there's a concrete documentary that brings evidence only from the 1100s. For several centuries, let's say this record reflects that the Jews were unfortunately persecuted within the region and expelled on a regular basis. Early sources, I think from 11th, 12th century territory, mention official, let's say, robust debates or disputations between Christians and Jews, and in which attempts were made to convince the Jews of the truth of Christianity. Obviously it's not, we know that, we are Orthodox Jews who believe in Hashem and so on and so forth, and to try to convert them at that point in time. They were documented in the other provinces at earlier days, especially after expulsion from France in 1321, and the persecutions in the Hainaut and the Rhine provinces over there. Now, I think the first Jews in the province of Gelderland were reported in 1325. They were Jewish people, had been settled in Nijmegen, the oldest settlement in Doesburg, Arnhem, and Zutphen, I think, especially since 1404. As of the 13th century, there are sources that indicate that Jews were living in Brabant and Limburg, apparently, mainly in cities such as Brussels, that's in Belgium, naturally, Leuven, Tienen, and the Jewish street of Maastricht, which is a Dutch spelling is Judenstraat. And from 1295 is another old proof of their existence. Anyone tuning in live, welcome to our community and our channel. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and you will see over fantastic video history content. Okay, sources from the 14th century also mention Jewish residents in cities of Antwerp and Mechelen, and in northern region of Gelder, I think between 1347 and 1351. Europe was hit by the plague, or the Black Death plague. This will result in a new theme in medieval anti-Semitic rhetoric. The Jewish people were held responsible for the epidemic, you can see anti-Semitism there, and for the way it was rapidly spreading, because presumably they were the ones who had poisoned the water they accused, let's just say another anti-Semitic claim, of springs used by Christians. I think there's various medieval chronicles mention this. Those of Rodolphus, I think de Rivio, I think he himself, that was in 1403, of Tongeren, would write that the Jews, he wrote that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Jews were murdered in Brabant region and in the city of Zwolle because they were accused of spreading the Black Death. This accusation was added to other traditional blood libels against the Jewish community. They were accused of piercing the host used for communion, of killing, let's just say, Christian children to use as a blood offering during Pesach. This obviously terrible anti-Semitic blood libel. The local Jewish communities were often, unfortunately, murdered in part or entirely exiled in hysterical pogroms. In May 1370, 6 Jews were burned at the stake in Brussels because they were accused of theft and of desecrating the holy sacrament, their holy sacrament, let's just say. Remember, once again, we're Orthodox Jews who believe in Hashem, and there's prohibitions even to go to their churches, I have to say, about, according to Jewish law. In addition, documentation can be found of instances in which Jews were abused and insulted. For example, in Zutphen, in Deventer, and in Utrecht, for allegedly, let's say, desecrating the host over there. Rioters massacred the majority of the Jews in the region and expelled those who survived. I think it was in the year 1394, the Duke of Guelders, who was authorized by the Emperor Louis, I think, IV, of the Roman Empire, they call it Holy, to receive Jews in his duty, where they provided service, they paid a tax, and were protected by the law. I think in Arnhem, where, let's say, there was a Jewish physician, is mentioned, the magistrate defended him against the hostilities of the populace. When Jews would go on to settle in Diocese of Utrecht, it is unknown, but rabbinical records regarding Jewish dietary laws speculated that the Jewish community, those, let's say, they're dated to Roman times, apparently. In 1444, Jews were expelled from the city of Utrecht. Until 1789, that was, Jews were prohibited from staying in the city overnight. They were tolerated in the village, I believe, of Marsin, 2 hours, let's say, distant, though their condition was not, I think, fructitious. But the community of Marsin was one of, let's say, the most important Jewish settlements in the Netherlands. Jews were admitted to Zeeland by Albert, Duke of Bavaria, also respectively. Now, I think it was in the year 1477, there was a marriage of Mary of Burgundy to the Archduke Maximilian, the son of Emperor Frederick III. The Netherlands were united to Austria, and its possessions passed the crown of Spain. In the 16th century, it was owing to the persecutions of Charles V and Philip II of Spain, the Netherlands became involved in a series of desperate and heroic struggles against a growing population and Catholic religious hegemony. I think it was in 1522, Charles V issued a proclamation in Gelderland and in Utrecht against Christians who were suspected of being lax at that point in time in the faith, as well as against Jews who had not been baptized at that point in time. It's totally forbidden for a Jewish person to be baptized. I'm going to say that now. He repeated such edicts in 1545 and 1549, trying to, let's say, suppress the Protestant Reformation, which was expanding. And I think come 1571, the Duke of Alba notifies the authorities of Arnhem that all Jewish people living there should be seized and held under their fates, and that was determined. I think at Dutch request, Matthias, Holy Roman Emperor, established religious peace in most of the provinces. Very interestingly. So it's let's talk a bit about the Dutch golden age of the 17th century. It was also the golden age of the Portuguese in Netherlands. From the early migration of the Portuguese immigrants, there was an establishment of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. There was prosperity. There was commercial networks connecting Amsterdam to the larger Atlantic world. And let's say there was precipitous decline of the community after a series of Anglo-Dutch wars in the late 17th century. Amsterdam was called the Dutch Jerusalem over there. Now we're going to talk about migration to the Netherlands in the next coming minutes, friends, over here. We're just going to take a very short break for a minute at the moment, but in the meantime, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel in the meantime while we're taking this break. And we're going to continue talking about the migration to the Netherlands and then maybe a few of the earlier rabbis in due course. So just watch your space. For a minute, and we'll do that. Okay, thanks everyone for being patient, and we're going to continue talking now about Dutch Jewry, the early years over here. Let's talk about the topic over here, migration to the Netherlands. Two events brought Jews to Holland, to the Netherlands. There was a 1579 Union of Utrecht of the northern provinces of the Netherlands will guarantee freedom of conscience. I think this is in Article 13, formalizing their, let's say, political arrangement. And I think come up 1581, the deputies of United Provinces declared independence from Spain by using the Act of Abjuration, which deposed King Philip as their sovereign. Now, come on, Philip was a fierce defender of the Catholic orthodoxy and was now also the monarch of Portugal. let's say, invigorating the Portuguese Inquisition. Portuguese Jewish people sought a religious haven, and which I think northern Netherlands at that point would appear to be, as well as a location with commercial opportunities. And I think come with the late 16th century, the Dutch Republic was not necessarily the obvious destination, since there was no established Jewish community for Portuguese, let's say, conversos, new Christians, to move if they wanted to Judaize after outwardly living as Christians. So many people would have wanted to. But I think the early history of Sephardic community formation in Netherlands, there's various speculations and investigations, but it's rooted in Spanish and Portuguese religious history. In Spain, under the Catholic monarchs, Jewish people who refused conversion to Christianity were expelled in 1492 under the Alhambra decree, with many, let's say, leaving for the more tolerant Kingdom of Portugal. However, Portuguese edicts of 1496 and 1497 of King Emmanuel forced Jewish people to convert, but also blocked their leaving the kingdom. In Spain, converted Jews called conversos or new Christians came under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, which was vigilant against their continuing to practice Judaism in secret as crypto-Jews, or as a pejorative term Marrano. In Portugal, there was no already established Portuguese Inquisition. Jews forced to convert, yet did not immediately face penalties for privately practicing Judaism, while publicly being Catholics, so that they continued to be a strong Jewish presence over there. The Portuguese Jewish men migrating to Amsterdam, many of whom were merchants, had a very high literacy rate compared to Dutch men in general population. Portuguese Jewish merchants had already settled in Antwerp in southern Netherlands, and let's say an entrepot for trade in various commodities of the Iberian Peninsula, such as sugar, bullion, spices, silver, kesef as we call it, and tobacco. They also settled in various other places, like in France, and a few pockets will go to London, Hamburg also. Amsterdam was not necessarily the obvious destination in the late 16th century for Jewish merchants, as the Spanish Netherlands became a hub of commerce internationally. Portuguese Jews moved to Antwerp and later Amsterdam to pursue commercial opportunities. Let's say as the northern provinces became, let's say, a Protestant stronghold, Dutch rebels fought for their independence from Spain and religious tolerance as a principle. Let's say effectively achieving autonomy, which was finally recognized by Spain back in the year 1648 after the 80 Years' War. Now come on, in late 16th century, some Sephardic Jews from Iberian Peninsula, also known as Sepharad, which is a Hebrew name naturally for Iberia, started to settle in the Netherlands, especially Amsterdam, gaining a foothold, but with an unclear status. A few Ashkenazic Jews had migrated from Germany to the Ommerlands in the 1570s, and in the mid to late 17th century, Ashkenazic Jews from Central Europe begin to migrate in greater numbers. Although I think persecuted in Central Europe, they would Ashkenazic Jews had lived as Jews before migrating to the Netherlands. The first group of Jews of any numbers in the Groningen was in Appingedam in 1563, where they came into conflict, I think, with Dutch guilds for sales of meat and cloth. Now, I think Emden is going to provide the Amsterdam Portuguese immigrants with their first rabbi, if I'm not mistaken, someone named Rabbi Moses Uri Halevi, also known as Philips Justi, until the community was established enough to begin training Portuguese men to the rabbinate at that stage in time. So, that's very, very interesting. So I think the two communities were ethnically distinct within Judaism, with separate, obviously, religious organizations. Let's speak a bit about Rabbi Moses Uri Halevi over here. I don't think we mentioned him before on this series. He lived between around 1543, maybe up till 1625 or maybe 1621. And they assume, just reading Wikipedia here, that maybe he passed away in Amsterdam. They also warned not to confuse him with Rabbi Moses ben Joseph ben Merwan Halevi, or Rabbi Mula Moshe Halevi of Kashan, and other rabbis with that name in of itself. Now, I think it was, very, very interesting. it could be he was a German rabbi. He became an instrumental figure and a key founder of the Spanish-Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. Born likely in either the German city of Witmund or Braunschweig, he became the first chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Amsterdam and is considered the founder of the first Jewish community in Amsterdam and the first rabbi of a Sephardic community in Northern Europe. So what a Scots he's got over here. And let's speak about him. He's a key rabbi. He was born to Joseph ben Ephraim Halevi, who was a native Braunschweig. He probably had to flee his home, predicted over. Back in the year 1557, it was when the Jews were expelled. He would settle in East Frisian Emden, and Ashkenazic Jews had settled there for several years before the Count of East Friesland had placed him under their special protection. Halevi is the first, Rabbi Halevi, the first Emden Jew whose name had been passed down, let's just say. I think various variants of his name are known, such as Feibish Emden in Jewish sources, as the Yiddish equivalent of the Hebrew name Uri, or in Dutch, Philips Joost. Now, the first name Moses is not documented during his lifetime. Now, Rabbi Halevi would live in Emden for around 40 years. According to his own statements, he officiated from around 1570 to 1600 as a teacher and a rabbi for the small Ashkenazic Jewish community there, and apparently had a network of contacts in Europe. Come up 1598, he was arrested as an exposed member of the community with two other Jewish men by the Emden Council, but was released on the basis of a petition from the Prague and Bohemian Jewish elders to Emperor Rudolf II. Let's say despite there was a benevolence of Count Eno III, who profited economically from the trading activities of Jews, the citizens and clergy demanded their expulsion at that point in time. And according to tradition, I think it's also the founding legend of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community. In 1601, a group of conversos, of new Christians, under the leadership of someone named Jacob Tirado, reached Emden by ship. The ship that came from London is said to have been driven off by a storm. They came from families who, as descendants of forced Christian converts who wished to become Jews, had little knowledge of their Jewish religion of their ancestors. A Hebrew inscription made them aware of the home of Moses Uri Halevi and went to see him. When they found out that he was indeed a Jewish person, they asked him to teach them about Judaism. Now, Rabbi Halevi had suggested that they go to Amsterdam together because they could freely practice their religion there. According to other sources, this initiative, let's say, may have come from Uri's son, someone named Aaron, who, unlike his father, who only spoke German, was able to communicate to conversos in Spanish. The narrative of these events, I think, was described very much by his grandson of Moses and Aaron's son, the printer Uri Phoebus Halevi. I think he had a 1711 printed book called the Nuraco de Vinda dos Judios Estefanos at Amsterdam. And I think another report differs in there is that the establishment of contact between the group Halevi. Now, Uri Halevi, a son Joseph, is said to have traded with conversos as early as in 1598 and established connections at that point in time. Now, just a few weeks after their arrival in Calvinist Amsterdam, Rabbi Moses Halevi and his son Aaron are said to have been arrested. The reason for the arrest was the suspicion that masses were being held in Latin, let's say, in their home, which is why it was assumed that they were Spanish Catholics, let's say, hated in the Netherlands. Both men were released shortly after they had, let's say, declared that they were Jews. According to other information, Rabbi Halevi was imprisoned again because he he earned his money as a fence, a pawnbroker, a circumciser, which he was able to refute, I think. Now, the first group of conversos was followed by others from Portugal to Amsterdam. The wealthy Jewish people who, let's say, traded across Europe were welcomed in impoverished Netherlands. They rented a house in Amsterdam, where they were evidently instructed by Halevi, who, however, did not necessarily have to be aware of the difference between the various rites. And I think it's believed, actually, chronicled over here by Wikipedia, that Halevi was in possession of the Sephardic Amsterdam Machzor, the prayer book, and on whose basis he introduced the Moranos to Jewish rites. I think, let's say, this manuscript is said to have passed on to his grandson, Moses, later, and in 1603, the Portuguese community, Bet Jacob, was founded. Historically remarkable is the fact that he, Moses Uri Levi, who happened to be an Ashkenazic rabbi, will be the builder of the Sephardic community, interesting enough. He was a rabbi and circumcised the converso men who had, let's say, no such opportunity in Catholic Iberia. He was a ritual slaughterer of animals. Himself, he was a shochet. Himself, he was a provisioner of kosher meat to the community. His son Aaron acted as a chazan, a cantor. Both are said to have performed a total of around 2,500 Brit Milah circumcisions. Despite all these functions within the Portuguese Jewish community, the Halevi family were among, let's say, the poorer inside the community over there, which we have to point out. Which is actually interesting. You see how much work he did. So, yeah, and I think they were dependent on donations from richer Sephardim. The Ashkenazi descendants of Halevi retained special rights within the Sephardic community for around 100 years. These special rights could have given rise to a dispute between the grandson, Uri Phoebus Halevi, and the community, after which he gave the Amsterdam Machzor as a gift to the Sephardic community in the year 1669. I think in addition, Aaron and Joseph, two other children, are recorded for Halevi, Rabbi Halevi, a daughter of an unknown name, and Jacob, the progenitor of the Jacobson family in Hamburg. Let's say in a prominent Swedish branch of his descendants, named von Reis. Notable names including Issa Quenzel, Magnus Ugla, Stefan Anderson, and Siri von Reis over here. We're going to continue talking. We're going to take another short break over here for a minute, and we're going to go back and talk more as we progress this era, now coming into the 1600s. So watch your space, and don't forget to subscribe in the meantime, and we'll be back in a minute, friends. Okay, shalom everyone, thanks for being patient over here and waiting as we're exploring the history of the Netherlands Jewish community here on this special edition over here, friends. It's going to be a multiple part series, so if you just tuning in live for the first time, welcome to our community over here. And let's go back a little bit now over here and talk about the Dutch provinces. They would actually provide mostly favorable conditions for observant Jews to establish a community and to practice their religion privately. To establish a Jewish community, a rabbi needed to be brought to Amsterdam. No such rabbi existed among the Portuguese conversos. Those wishing to live as Jews under rabbinical authority, let's say, obviously would learn the practices, and we saw that Rabbi Moses Uri Halevi of Emden would become the rabbi that very much did that over there. So very, very interesting. It will create a sacred space for Jewish worship, which obviously was initially a problem since the Amsterdam authorities did not envision Jews to be included in the notion of religious toleration. Someone named Jacob Tyrada, also known as James Lopez da Costa, obtained permission from the authorities to practice Judaism within his household, but not publicly. Tyrada was a significant contributor to the establishment of the Portuguese Jewish community. 3 Portuguese congregations were created in the early 17th century, which merged and in the late 17th century and built the large Portuguese synagogue, the Esnoga, still in use today. Okay, I'm just going to say blessing. I've just got a drink over here and say Shir Hakol blessing. Everyone, you're tuning in live, please subscribe to the channel and let's try and get to 9,000 subscribers, Bezrat Hashem, by Tu B'Shvat. That will be a good goal over here. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nהיה b'dvarav. Okay. So another important factor within regards to the Jewish community, or definitely was seen as an important factor, was having a Jewish burial ground over there. I think in Amsterdam, they were initially denied rights to one. And in 1606 and 1608, with no explanation, they buried their dead in Groet, but eventually secured land in an area called Ouderkerk for the Portuguese Jewish burials. The cemetery is 5 miles south of central Amsterdam, and the burial of the maternal grandfather was Borg Spinoza, who would be put in excommunication later on, we're going to learn about. Henry Grasses, also alias Baruch Sr., provides some insight into questions of eligibility to be buried in this cemetery. I think when he moved from Antwerp to Amsterdam, he requested permission to be buried in the cemetery. However, he did not participate in worship at either of the then existing congregations. He remained uncircumcised his entire life, but before his burial in, I think it was in Ouderkerk cemetery, he had this Brit Milah, he was circumcised. Posthumously, I think Grasses' burial place was located outside the formal boundaries of the cemetery in a fringe reserved for uncircumcised marginal types not fully belonging to the community. And I think there'll be tombstones over there, numerous Jewish burial grounds, if I'm not mistaken, which would provide useful information on at that stage in time. I think it would provide useful information on individual Jewish men and women, as well as the Jewish communities as a whole, until 1796, when Jews were granted citizenship and no longer would be segregated, if I'm not mistaken. Let's explore a bit with regards to Jacob Torrido, who is a key figure in the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch history of it. I believe he was born in the year 1540 and he died in Jerusalem in 1620, obviously being one of the founders of the Spanish-Portuguese community of Amsterdam. And so with several Marranos, he settled from Portugal in a vessel which was driven out of its course in Emden, in East Friesland, following the advice of Rabbi Moses Uriah Levi. He continued his travels with his companions to Amsterdam in 1593, and his arrival there, he confessed the Jewish faith openly, and afterwards, through advance in years, underwent the rite of circumcision. Together with Jacob Israel Belmonte and Samuel Pelagi, they founded the Spanish-Portuguese community in Amsterdam, being its first president he was. So he's a key figure in the founding of S&P Jewry of Amsterdam. Now, let's say he acquired a house in the Houtgracht. He transformed it into Amsterdam's first synagogue, which is called, after him, Bet Yaakov, obviously, or a Kasad Jacob in Ladino. The Beth Jacob consecrated at the Jewish New Year's festival, I think it was in September 1597. I think annually on Day of Atonement and Yom Kippur, a special prayer in his behalf is recited as an acknowledgement of his important services to the community. In his old age, Mr. Turido travelled to Jerusalem, where he passed away over there at that point in time. I think it was in 1620. Let's speak about a few key figures from the famous Pelagi family. We've spoken about it before. They go on to become great rabbis also in Turkey later on. I think some of the relatives would also. Samuel Pelagi, who was he? He lived between 1550 to 1616. He was a Jewish Moroccan merchant. He was a diplomat. He was a pirate of the Pelagi family. He was an envoy, I believe. Concluded a treaty with the Dutch Republic. In 1608, his antecedents fled to Morocco during the Reconquista. They appointed as an agent under the Saadi Sultan Zidan Abu Mali. And I think Mr. Pelagi travelled to the newly independent Dutch Republic over there to discuss diplomatic terms with the Dutch against their mutual enemy at the time, the Spanish. He died in the Netherlands. He was brought there due to the intervention of his ally, Maurice of Nassau, who helped him when he was arrested by the Spanish. I think he was born in Fez in Morocco. He passed away at The Hague in Netherlands. Buried in Bet Hayim of Ouderkerk and de Amstel. He had various different names, different ways of pronouncing his last name. And he was a Moroccan-Dutch trade, let's just say. He was mostly known in 1608 for the Moroccan-Dutch trade agreement. His notable work was the first Portuguese minion in Amsterdam, without a doubt. His spouse's name was Mrs. Rayner, I believe. Or I think a Hebrew name actually being Malka, if I'm not mistaken. He'd have children, Isaac and Jacob, Carlos, if I'm not mistaken. Other relatives, especially Joseph Pelagi, his brother and nephews, famous ones, Isaac, Joshua, David, Moses, and Abraham. Let's explore a bit more with in regards to him. He was born in Fez. His father was Rabbi Isaac Pelagi. I think he's first mentioned in the various different takanot of the Jewish community. I think in 1588, his brother was Joseph Pelagi. His uncle was the Fez's grand rabbi, Rabbi Judah Uziel. His son, Rabbi Isaac Uziel, was a rabbi in the Neve Shalom community in Amsterdam. Very interesting enough. Now, I believe his family originated from Al-Andalus, which is obviously now Spain, where his father would serve as a rabbi in Cordoba. According to a Professor Mercedes Garcia Arenal, the Pelagis were a Sephardi family, perhaps descended from the Ben Paliash, mentioned by the 12th century chronicler, someone named Abraham ibn David, one of the greatest, let's say, of the families of Cordoba. In the first half of the 16th century, following the Christian conquest of Islamic Spain, the family fled to Morocco, where Jews like Christians were tolerated as long as they accepted Islam as the state religion. Pelagi's surname is spelled, I think, various different names also, P-A-L-A-C-H-E on his death certificate, Pelashi. And he signed his name also as Palacio or Palatio. Other Dutch record shows Palatio or Palacio or Palazzo. So there's different ways, seemingly, of spelling his name also, according to various different records we're looking from. Anyone tuning in live at the moment, welcome and subscribe to the channel now. Please, we're trying to get to 9,000 subscribers by Jewish Festival of Tu B'Shvat. So please, that's only 4 weeks away over here. Please subscribe now. Rabbi Pelagi would arrive in Netherlands between 1590 and 1597. In 1591 in Middelburg, they offered a residential permit, but I think at that point in time, Protestant pastors protested. In 1596, he established one of the first informal Jewish communities in The Hague. after a delegation from the Dutch Republic visited Morocco to discuss a common alliance against Spain and the Barbary pirates, Sultan Zaidan Abu Mali, and I think in 1608 appointed a merchant, Samuel Pelagi, to interpret for his envoy, Hamou Ben Bashir, to the Dutch government in The Hague. Officially, Pelagi served as a Sultan's agent, not an ambassador over there. I think it was in June 1608, Pelagi met Stadtholder Maurice of Nassau and the States General in The Hague to negotiate an alliance of mutual assistance against Spain. On the 24th of December 1610, the two nations signed a treaty of friendship and free commerce, an agreement recognizing free commerce between the Netherlands and Morocco and allowing the Sultan to purchase ships, arms and munitions from the Dutch. This was one of the first official treaties between a European country and a non-Christian nation of the 16th century and treaties or the Franco-Ottoman alliance. I think the story goes that one day Mr. Pelagi's horse-drawn carriage met the carriage of the Spanish ambassador in The Hague. The two carriages were unable to pass one another, and to cheers from onlookers, the Spanish ambassador's carriage had to make way for Pelagi's carriage. So very, very interesting. That's actually chronicled over. And I think in 1614, Pelagi, having captured, let's say, a Portuguese ship, was unable to bring its cargo into shore in Morocco, and so sailed for the Netherlands at that point in time. I think there was a heavy storm, and disease among his men forced him to seek refuge in an English port, whereby the request of the Spanish ambassador, he was arrested and imprisoned, and eventually Prince Maurice came to his aid and helped bring him to the Netherlands. And however, he had lost all his money by then and fell ill shortly afterwards. Very interesting. So I think in 1616, 4th of February, he died in The Hague and was buried at the gravestone, with the gravestone, in the Bet Haim of Okerk on Amstel, cemetery of the Portuguese Jewish community. Thousands would attend his funeral. The record of his grave spells his name, Pelagi, describes him as a Moroccanas Gezant, Moroccan envoy. It cites a birthplace of Fez and burial place in Hebrew calendar of Shvat, I think the 16th. So very interesting. Just a day after Tu B'Shvat, 4th of February, 1616. It lists three sons, Isaac, Moses and David. On his tombstone it's written over here, Hanoseh Tov Im Elohim Ba'adam, a verse from the book of Proverbs, Mishlei, which means carries good with God and man. Very interesting. So he leaves a big legacy also, let's just say, in himself. Okay, let's continue now. Let's speak about Joseph Pelagi over here. He was another key person in Amsterdam, Dutch Republic. We're going to go through in each of these videos biography videos of biographies of some of the famous personalities that will shape Dutch Jewry also. So Joseph was seemingly was born in 1570, and there's different opinions when he passed away. According to one opinion, maybe 1637, 38, or even as far as 1657. He was a Jewish Moroccan merchant and a diplomat of the Pelagi family, and an envoy. He helped his brother conclude a treaty with the Dutch Republic in 1608, which he spoke about before. He was born in Fez, interestingly. He had different names, if I'm not mistaken. He had children, Isaac, Joshua, David, Moses, Abraham. His father was Isaac Pelagi, of the great rabbi of Fez, Rabbi Isaac Pelagi. Had various different great relatives also. Let's explore a bit within regards to him. He was born in Fez. Obviously, Rabbi Isaac Pelagi was a rabbi there, first mentioned Takanot, as we mentioned before. I think his brother, obviously, Rabbi Samuel Pelagi, his uncle, the Fez's grand Rabbi Judah Uziel, whose son Isaac Uziel was rabbi within the Beis Shalom community in Amsterdam, which we spoke about before. His family originated, obviously, from the Islamic Spain at that point in time, where his father had served as a rabbi in Cordoba, as we mentioned about on various occasions before. During, I think, the first half of the 16th century, following the Christian conquest of Islamic Spain, the family fled to Morocco, where Jews like Christians were tolerated as long as they accepted Islam as official religion over there, we have to point out. And they arrived as unclear. One Italian historian says, Versio, this is the whole thing in Italian. The Pelagi family also emigrated to the Netherlands, perhaps from Portugal or Spain, or second, another hypothesis. They emigrated directly from their native Spain to Fez, where Isaac Pelagi, the rabbi, was in 1588. The surname is spelled different ways, as we grappled with before. Let's speak about Isaac Pelagi over here. He lived between 1593 to 1650, seemingly. He was born in 1593, I think most likely in Fez, Morocco, the son of Joseph Pelagi, the nephew of Samuel Pelagi. Came obviously from the famous Sephardic Pelagi family. He studied at the University of Leiden, where he registered in February 1629. With his half-brother Abraham, he served as an agent from the Netherlands to Morocco on his father's behalf. And I think what's interesting, he, unfortunately, sadly, I think he converted to Christianity. It's reported here in Wikipedia before 1629. Not much is known about his death, but that's very, very sad to hear about. Like, he's also part of that family. Okay, sorry about that. Let's speak now about Moses Pelagi. He died also in 1650. He was a Jewish Moroccan-born merchant, obviously diplomat, once again, and will become as a leader of second generation. Once again, also known as for the Moroccan-Dutch trade agreement. Very much so. His father was Joseph Pelagi, and obviously his uncle was Samuel Pelagi. Would study languages at University of Leiden, if I'm not mistaken. And thanks to his many languages he knew, as a young man, he was able to help his father and uncle prepare important negotiations for which they rewarded him. The States General of Netherlands considered him a jeune homme de bonne exception, a young man of good prospects, very qualified, knowledgeable in business affairs and several languages. And he partook in a mission to Istanbul between 1614 to 1616. Now, after the death of his uncle Samuel, he went to live in Morocco and served at the court of Fez, where I think 1622, 1642, he served as European secretary and an interpreter. He became a chief interpreter and a translator from Spanish, Dutch and French into Arabic for the rules of Morocco. During these years, he served under 4 sultans of Morocco, I think between 1618 to 1650. Muli Zaidan, I think 1603 to 1627. Muli Abd al-Malik, 1623 to 1627. Muli al-Walid, between 1631 and 1636. And Muli Muhammad and Sheikh al-Sakir, between 1636 and 1655. He became a very important and influential figure at the Moroccan court. He was responsible for international and diplomatic dealings, we have to point out. I think in 1656, Menashe ben Israel wrote, "In the kingdom of Barbary, there lives also a great number of lus at Morocco. The court aids king's house, where they have their nagut, or prince, that governs them, and is their luj, and it's called at this day Signor Moshe Pelagi." His name actually appears in various English records from 1636 till he passed away, and in Spanish translation of a 1638 treaty between the English and Moroccans. His prominence in Morocco led many relatives to return there from the Netherlands, including his brothers Joshua and Abraham. Joshua became a tax official. Abraham set up a port of Safi, where his provisional ships, served as unofficial consult for the Dutch. Now, okay, we're going to speak about Menashe ben Israel, great rabbi, in the next episode. Let's speak a bit about Baruch Spinoza. We'll know he's excommunicated at a later stage. Very much we learn about that already. But he lived between 1632 to 1677. It's important we speak about him because much of what we say about during that hard era, he was not necessarily the greatest character from an Orthodox Jewish perspective. He was also known as the Latinized pen name Benedictus de Spinoza. He was a philosopher of Jewish Portuguese origin. He was born and lived in the Dutch Republic, and he was a forerunner, let's just say, of the Age of Enlightenment at that point in time. And Spinoza significantly influenced, as a modern biblical criticism and rationalism, you could say 17th century. And he was a Dutch intellectual. Culture established himself as one of the most important, as a radical philosophers, as described, of the early modern period. He was influenced by Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, Ibn Tufay, and was a leading philosopher, let's just say, of a Dutch golden age, by many would describe. He was born in Amsterdam and he passed away in The Hague, in the Dutch Republic. He was 44 years of age. He learned, I think, in Talmud Torah originally, and the University, once again, of Leiden. I don't think he got a degree, it's reported over. So you can say it was really the starting part of the Age of Enlightenment. He was born in Amsterdam to a Marrano family that fled Portugal, but let's say the more tolerant Dutch Republic. He received traditional Jewish education, learning Hebrew, studied various different textual information within Portuguese Jewish community. I think his father was a prominent merchant also. He challenged rabbinical authority and questioned Jewish doctrines, which already was not a good sign, leading to his permanent expulsion from the Jewish community in 1656. Remember, there's etiquette, how people have dialogue. Following that expulsion, he distanced himself, I think, from all religious affiliations and devoted himself more to philosophical inquiry and lens grinding. Now, Rabbi Spinoza attracted a dedicated circle of followers who gathered to discuss his writings and joined him in the intellectual pursuit of truth. At that point in time, let's just say he was searching it, let's just say. He published little to avoid a persecution and bans on his books. Obviously, he was worried about it, but excommunicated. And his Tractus Theologicon Politicus, described by Stephen Nanler as one, he would describe over here, this Mr. Nanler, as an important book of Western thought. He questioned, he came with various heretical questions, let's just say, at that point in time, which would justify his excommunication. Building on Hebrew Bible, criticism, ethics, let's just say, in of itself, and I think he rejected messianism, for example, and the emphasis of afterlife. He emphasized appreciating and valuing life for oneself and others. Remember, as Orthodox Jews, we do not support whatever his comments are over there whatsoever, so hence leading to the excommunication. He advocated for individual liberty in its moral, psychological, and metaphysical dimensions. He established, let's say, the general or political writing called secular theology. Now, his ancestors were adherents of Crypto-Judaism. They faced persecution in the Portuguese Inquisition. I think in 1597, his paternal grandfather, so family left Vitigura for Nantes and would live actually as new Christians outwardly. His maternal ancestors were leading Porto commercial family. His maternal grandfather was a foremost merchant who drifted between Judaism and Christianity. And Spinoza was raised by his grandmother from the age of 6 to 9 and probably learned, let's say, a lot about his family from her. His father, Michael, was a prominent and wealthy merchant in Amsterdam with I think he had a business that had wide geographical reach. And I think in 1649, he was elected to serve as an administrative officer of the recently, United Congregation and the Talmud Torah, if I'm not mistaken. He married Rachel de Espinosa, I think his cousin, the daughter of his uncle Abraham de Espinosa, who was a community leader and Michael's business partner. I think it was very common in those days, reported over, for people to marry cousins, especially in the Portuguese Jewish community over there, if I'm not mistaken. After the death of Rachel, Michael married Hannah to Deborah, with whom he had 5 children. His second wife brought a dowry to the marriage that was, I think, absorbed into Michael's business capital instead of being set aside for her children, if I'm not mistaken, which I think caused reported over a grudge over here between Spinoza and his father, if I'm not mistaken. The father lived on the family lived on an artificial island on the south side of the river, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so very, very interesting. I think they'd have various children. Miriam would be the first child, followed by Isaac, who was expected to take over as a family head and the commercial enterprise. He died in 1649. Boris Spinoza, I think the third child was born on 24th. Okay, sorry. This is siblings. Now I'm speaking about Boris Spinoza. Miriam was, I think, the oldest, Isaac, and he was the third, and born on the 24th of November 1632, and named as per tradition for his maternal grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. He had a younger brother, Gabriel, was born in 1634, followed by another sister, Rebecca. Miriam married someone named Samuel de Caceres, but died shortly after childbirth, we have to point out. I think Samuel had to marry his former sister-in-law, Rebecca, following his brother's death. Spinoza, let's say, had a place as a head of family, and its business meant, let's say, scholarly ambitions were pushed aside. Spinoza's mother, Hannah Deborah, died when Spinoza was 6 years old. Michael's third wife, Esther, raised Spinoza from the age 9 and didn't have much Jewish knowledge due to growing up in a new Christian and only spoke Portuguese at home. The marriage was childless. Spinoza's sister, brother Gabriel, and the nephew eventually migrated, I think, to Corcel, and the remaining family joined them after Spinoza's death. Yeah. I think Spinoza's, through his mother, Spinoza was related to a philosopher, someone named Uriel da Costa, will also stir controversy in Amsterdam's Portuguese Jewish community. The Costa questioned traditional Christian and Jewish beliefs, asserting that, for example, the origins were based on human inventions instead of God's revelation. And that's something we just to point out also. So really controversy does run inside this family, you could say. During his childhood, Spinoza was likely unaware of his family connection with Uriel da Costa. Still as a teenager, he had heard discussions about him, I believe, at that point in time. Let's talk about his school days and business. He attended Talmud Torah school, adjoining to the Bet Yaakov synagogue, a few doors down from his home, headed by the senior rabbi at the time, Rabbi Saul Levi Morteria, I think instructed in Spanish language, learning and literature to read at that point in time. And it was said Rashi commentary. His name does not appear on the registry after age 14. Has likely never studied with rabbis of the caliber of Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, who we'll speak about hopefully next class, and Rabbi Morteria. Spinoza, I think, possibly went on to work around 14 and almost certainly was needed in his father's business after his brother died in 1649. I think it was the first Anglo-Dutch war, if I'm not mistaken, which was much to Spinoza's firm's ships and cargo were captured by English ships, severely affecting the firm's financial viability. The firm was saddled with debt by their war's end in 1654 due to its merchant voyages being intercepted by the English, which would lead to the decline, let's say. And Spinoza's father died in 1654, made him the head of the family, responsible for organising and leading Jewish mourning rituals, and in a business partnership with his brother of their inherited firm. I think Spinoza's father had poor health for some years before he died. He was significantly involved in the business, putting his intellectual curiosity on hold. And I think it was in 1656, he continued financially supporting the synagogue and attended services in compliance with the synagogue's conventions and practice. I think by 1655, the family's wealth had evaporated and the business effectively ended at that point in time. 1656, Spinoza went to the city authority for protection against debts in the Portuguese Jewish community, let's say, free himself from responsibility of paying debts owed by his father. He appealed to the city to declare him an orphan since he was legal minor. Not understanding his father's indebtedness would remove the obligation to pay his debts and retrospectively renounce their inheritance. He was released of all debts and legally in the right. His reputation as a merchant was obviously damaged permanently within regards to that. He was expelled from the Jewish community, I think July 1656. Talmud Torah community leaders, which included Rabbi Aboab de Fonseca, issued a writ of herem, excommunication, against 22-year-old Spinoza. Spinoza's censure was the harshest ever pronounced in the community, which carried, let's say, huge, tremendous emotional and spiritual impact. The exact reason for expelling Spinoza, not necessarily exactly stated, there's other reasons, only referring, let's just say, maybe to his abominable heresies, let's say, or monstrous deeds, and the testimony of witnesses in the presence of the said Spinoza. Even though the Amsterdam municipal authorities were not directly involved in its, let's say, censure, the town council expressly ordered the Portuguese Jewish community to regulate the conduct and ensure that the community kept strict observance of Jewish law, if I'm not mistaken. Other evidence indicates a concern about upsetting civil authorities, such as synagogue bans, public weddings, funeral processions, and discussing religious matters with Christians and various other things. So we can say more about him. Now, friends, we're just going to walk and talk for another minute over here about a bit more maybe about the Netherlands Jewish community. Okay, shalom everyone, we're going to speak a bit more about the Dutch community here. It's our first edition here on this series of the Netherlands, and very, very interesting, friends, over here. Just recording this actually from a bakery here in the city of Bet Shemesh. It's Bet Shemesh Dalet to be precise over here. We've got new restaurants and so on and so forth, which is obviously very, very exciting and interesting actually to see, friends, over here on this special edition as we're exploring the Jewish community of Amsterdam over here. Okay, so let's continue over here. We're speaking about the Netherlands Jewish community over here on this special edition over here, friends. So anyone, if you're tuning in live and you're new here, welcome to our community. Let's speak about Francisco de Carcaras. He was a writer of 17th century. Let's just say the son of Daniel de Carcaras of Amsterdam. He translated from Italian into Spanish, the Vision, a specific book, a work written by Alfonso de la Torre and translated into Italian by Domenico Dolfin. A translation, let's just say, published at Amsterdam in the year 1663, if I'm not mistaken, and dedicated to Don Emmanuel, and he was a Prince of Portugal. It consists of two parts. First, dealing with the various sciences, he was. The second with moral philosophy, or the first part. I think a chapter 1, treatise it was, of the evil of the things and the confusion in the world. The following 6 chapters, let's say, treat of logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astrology, and the remaining chapters, I think, treat of metaphysics, mnemonics and physics. Part 2 discusses ethics and politics. So I'm not mistaken, he was a famous man, I think, also from there. And someone named Johann Christian Wolff mixes Francisco de Carcaras, the author also of the Dialogos Centricos, published at Amsterdam in the year 1616, if I'm not mistaken. So very interesting. And ascribes that work, let's say, of Jacob de Carcaras, who probably a son of Moshe de Carcaras, one of the founders of the Jewish Portuguese community of Amsterdam. The later Francisco or Jacob, translated into Spain. Obviously, we have to point out that Jacob Tirado is a key person over there. Now, this family was a famous family. I think Francisco, or you could say Jacob, he had 5 sons. Let's explore them. They were, I think, key people connected to that area. I think Daniel de Carcaras was a writer of the 17th century, the son of Jacob de Carcaras, we have to point out. He held the degree of Master of Arts. He was a friend of Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, one of the most famous rabbis without a doubt of his time. We have to point out, let's say, the consolator on human frailty. He also wrote a eulogy of Rabbi Saul Levi Mortarieta, who I think this was in the year 1645, if I'm not mistaken. He was a great rabbi. David de Carcaras, I think he died in the year 1624, if I'm not mistaken. Once again, also in Amsterdam, we have to point out. So he was a key figure. These are 5 famous sons, let's just say, of that specific period in time we have to point out. Okay, so we can explore more. Then there was Henry de Carcaras. Who was he? I believe he lived, if I'm not mistaken, in England. I think around the year 1650, if I'm not mistaken. So he was very much a key figure in the 1600s. And I think, let's say, probably the same who with Benjamin de Carcaras petitioned the king on April 8th, 1661, to permit them to live and trade in Barbados and in Suriname. Now, another key figure is Samuel de Carcaras. Who was he? He was a Dutch poet, a preacher, and a brother-in-law of Benedict Spinoza. He died in November 1660, if I'm not mistaken, at Amsterdam. He was a pupil also of Rabbi Saul Levi Mortaria of Amsterdam, and the title, a specific title is given: a poet, a preacher, a cantor, and was given to him by his contemporaries. Let's say showed the eminent position which he occupied in the Jewish community of Amsterdam. And the last one over here from this family, Simon de Carcaras. He was a military strategist, a merchant he was, and a communal leader. He flourished in the middle of the 17th century. He was prominent in mercantile affairs in Hamburg, London, South America, and in West Indies, and his transactions extended to many parts of the world, we have to point out, which is very, very interesting. So as we're exploring the Dutch community over here, there's a lot to say about Rabbi Saul also. de Mauritania, now that we're speaking about him. Who was he? Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera. He lived between 1596 to 1660. He was rabbi in Amsterdam, born in Venice. We're going to speak about him and continue speaking about him, I think, in the next edition, friends, over here. I think on this note, we're going to wish you well. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks.